The lights were bright, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. Cameras panned across a polished studio where smiles were rehearsed and every second was orchestrated for smooth daytime television. This was The View, a place where current events met scripted spontaneity and where ideological confrontations often masqueraded as lighthearted dialogue. The segment was advertised as a respectful conversation about faith, values, and modern culture, but everyone watching, whether from home or behind the cameras, knew what kind of segment this would really be. Into this carefully curated world stepped Karoline Leavitt, young, poised, conservative, and unapologetically Christian. Her presence alone challenged the tone of the room. She wasn't just there to give sound bites. She was walking into a lion's den with the quiet confidence of someone who had counted the cost. Before we begin, tell us where are you watching from, also subscribe. She was seated at the end of the semicircular table, framed by the familiar New York skyline behind her, and surrounded by hosts whose ideological leanings were no secret. From the moment she was introduced, the tone was clear. Joy Behar, never one to miss a chance at a sarcastic jab, kicked off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Joining us today is Karoline Leavitt. She's young, conservative, and still believes in church. Imagine that. The audience chuckled, a few louder than others, clearly encouraged by the vibe being set. Karoline nodded slightly, her face neutral, giving no sign that the comment rattled her. She had expected this, everyone had. As the show segued into the planned segment, a short clip from The Chosen played across the studio monitors. The scene depicted Jesus speaking to a crowd, compassionate, strong, and deeply human. It was meant to be a soft opener, but the moment the video ended, Behar leaned in again, eyes gleaming, and quipped, "Well, at least they didn't cast a surfer dude to play him this time." Another wave of laughter rolled through the audience. You could almost hear the unspoken rules at play. It was safe to mock, safe to joke, because faith, to them, was just another topic to deconstruct for ratings. Sunny Hostin jumped in, her voice wrapped in polite condescension. "You know, Karoline, it's always interesting how Jesus is portrayed. For a lot of people growing up, he looked nothing like their community. Isn't it about time he looked like someone actually from the Middle East?" The question wasn't entirely unfair, but it wasn't really a question either. It was a provocation, a way to steer the conversation not toward belief or scripture, but toward politics and cultural battles, identity, representation, and modern outrage. The usual terrain. Karoline listened without interrupting. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture composed. But the direction of the conversation was clear. It was no longer about understanding. It was about framing her beliefs as outdated, exclusionary, even hypocritical. And then came the pivot. Alyssa Farah Griffin, attempting to play both sides, tilted her head and spoke as if gently guiding a younger sister. "Karoline, you speak passionately about your faith, which is great, but don't you think there's a disconnect between the teachings of Jesus and the policies you support? Jesus fed the poor, uplifted the outcast, yet your politics, they often prioritize budgets over people. Isn't that a contradiction?" The air shifted. The audience responded with a collective "ooh," a sound that lived somewhere between excitement and expectation. They were ready for a takedown. This was the moment they had come for. The audience knew the choreography. Make the conservative guest uncomfortable, push her to the edge, and wait for either defensiveness or collapse. Behar crossed her arms and leaned back with a smug grin. "You can't use the Bible as a prop, Karoline, and then vote against everything it teaches." More applause. The sign behind the camera blinked, and the crowd followed like a cue from a sitcom laugh track. The panelists exchanged knowing glances. Surely now the guest would falter, try to explain herself, maybe even backpedal. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She didn't rush to defend her record. She didn't launch into a counterattack. She simply waited. Silence filled the few seconds that followed, but it wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. Her expression was unreadable, but her composure was undeniable. She turned to Sunny, then Joy, her eyes steady, and said simply, "May I respond?" Behar raised her eyebrows with a theatrical wave of her hand. Of course, she said, voice dripping with forced civility. "We love conversation here." More soft laughter from the audience. As if everyone expected a nervous reply, maybe a few cliches, something easy to dismiss. But Karoline wasn't rattled. She looked directly into the camera, then slowly back to the women at the table, as if seeing each of them not as opponents, but as people. Her voice was quiet, but carried with clarity, rising above the noise without ever being loud. And then, just as everyone leaned in, waiting for a stammer, a retreat, or a defensive jab, she began to speak. Her gaze swept the table once more, not with defiance, but with a calm that felt disarming. The studio, once lively with banter, was now tense with expectation. Karoline's voice cut through that tension. Not loud, not forceful, but undeniably certain. "You're right about one thing," she said, her tone level. Jesus did feed the poor. He did uplift the brokenhearted. He gave his life for people who hated him. But the way you talk about him, as if he was a political mascot or a modern activist, misses the point entirely. Jesus wasn't a politician. He wasn't a party member. He was truth, and truth doesn't change depending on what network you're on. There was a beat of silence. Even Joy Behar, the seasoned veteran of sharp sound bites, didn't immediately respond. Karoline continued, slowly but without hesitation. "I believe in helping the poor. I believe in compassion, but I don't believe that government control is the same as personal responsibility. And I don't believe that just because someone quotes Jesus, they get to redefine him to fit their ideology. You want to talk about contradictions? Let's talk about how often people claim to follow him, yet dismiss everything he actually said." Sunny shifted in her seat slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. The audience, unsure whether to clap or wait for a cue, remained mostly quiet. Karoline wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't trying to own anyone, but her words were cutting because they came from a place of clarity, not performance. She wasn't defending her political party, she was defending her faith and doing it without anger, without retreating into slogans, and without trying to win a moment. She was speaking from something deeper. "There's this assumption," she went on, "that if you believe in the Bible, you're backward, that faith is something people grow out of, like fairy tales or Santa Claus, but millions of Americans, millions, build their lives around that book. And not because they're afraid of thinking, but because they have thought, because they've lived through things that politics can't fix, and because they know the difference between having hope and chasing illusions." At that, a quiet murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't what they expected. This wasn't the edited version of Christianity they were used to seeing, the kind with hollow smiles and pre-rehearsed lines. Karoline wasn't trying to convert the panel. She was reminding them, and everyone watching, that belief isn't always comfortable, and it doesn't always fit inside a pre-approved. Behar tried to interrupt. "But don't you think?" Karoline held up a hand gently. "I let you speak. May I finish?" Behar, for once, nodded without sarcasm. Karoline turned her attention back to the camera. "I didn't come here to be applauded," she said. "I came here because I believe this conversation matters. Not because I think I'm smarter or more righteous, but because I think we've forgotten how to listen. We've replaced real dialogue with cheap shots. We mock what we don't understand and dismiss what doesn't fit our narrative. And that's not progress, that's pride." There it was, the line that hit like a thunderclap, and just like that, the room shifted. You could feel it in the way the audience sat straighter, in how the laughter stopped, in the sudden stillness of the hosts who had been smiling moments before. Something had pierced through the media sheen, through the planned rhythm of applause and rebuttals. Karoline's words didn't just land, they echoed. She didn't scold, she didn't accuse, but somehow she had exposed something deeper, a discomfort not with her, but with the mirror she had quietly held up to the room. "Faith isn't weakness," she said finally. "It's the choice to believe in something greater than yourself, even when the world tells you not to, even when you're laughed at for it, even when you're told it's irrelevant, and that's okay, because the truth doesn't need applause to be true." She leaned back slightly, signaling she was done. No mic drop, no smug expression, just quiet resolve. For a moment, no one spoke. Behar opened her mouth, then closed it. Hostin looked down at her notes, but didn't reach for them. The applause sign lit up again, but barely anyone clapped. Not out of protest, but because they were processing. Something about Karoline's tone had stripped the usual theater from the moment. She hadn't won the debate with zingers. She had shifted the atmosphere, which was harder and far more unsettling. The producers in the booth whispered hurriedly. This wasn't going the way they expected. This wasn't viral in the usual way. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't an on-screen meltdown. It was worse. For them, it was real. Back on set, Joy Behar tried to pivot. "Well," she said, forcing a grin, "that's certainly thoughtful," but even she didn't sound convinced. The wind had gone out of the sails. Karoline smiled, not smugly, not triumphantly, just softly. "I appreciate being here." she said. Even if we don't agree, I'm grateful for the chance to speak. And somehow, in that brief ending note, she turned the tables completely. The panel had expected defensiveness, maybe over-eagerness to win approval. Instead, they were left sitting in the awkward space where conviction meets discomfort. She didn't storm out. She didn't revel in the moment. She simply waited as the host wrapped the segment with a quick commercial break, trying to recover the rhythm. But the internet wasn't so quick to move on. Clips of the exchange were already being clipped, uploaded, shared. People weren't sharing it for entertainment. They were sharing it because something rare had happened on live television. Someone stood for what they believed without apology and without turning it into a spectacle. It wasn't the fireworks that made the moment powerful. It was the silence that followed. The cameras faded to black as the show cut to commercial, but the silence that followed in the studio didn't disappear with the lights. There was no laughter echoing after the segment, no celebratory banter from the co-hosts. The usual follow-up, a light joke, a smooth pivot to a new topic, didn't happen. Something had unsettled them, and not in the usual viral TV kind of way. What Karoline had delivered wasn't flashy, wasn't angry, and certainly wasn't designed for applause, and yet it was unforgettable. Behind the scenes, producers spoke in hurried tones. "We may need to edit that for YouTube," one whispered. Another frowned at the live social media feed. Karoline's name was already trending, not because she had said something inflammatory, but because she hadn't. In a space where outrage was the currency, her refusal to play the game had stolen the show. Within hours, the moment was everywhere. Clips of Karoline's calm words, clipped just before the commercial break, began spreading across platforms. People weren't watching it once, they were rewatching it, quoting it, sharing it, not with mockery, but with resonance. The usual partisans lined up with their takes, sure, but beyond that, something strange was happening. People who didn't usually agree on anything were pausing to consider what they'd seen. Some wrote, "You don't have to agree with her politics to respect how she handled that." Others said, "She didn't own anyone. She didn't try to, that's what made it powerful." And still others admitted quietly, "I've always laughed at Christians on these shows, but this one made me stop and think." Not everyone liked it, of course. The usual critics dismissed her as polished, rehearsed, playing martyr, but those voices were noticeably quieter than usual, because deep down, even they could feel it. This wasn't a typical performance. This was something different, something dangerous, in the best way. It was someone standing their ground without turning it into a spectacle, someone who didn't need to shout to speak truth. And while the panel at The View moved on the next day with a fresh list of guests and topics, something about that moment lingered. It became part of a larger conversation happening in living rooms, youth groups, college dorms, and coffee shops. What happens when faith walks into a room that was never designed to welcome it? What happens when conviction refuses to be edited for palatability? For many people of faith, the moment felt like a breath of fresh air. They were used to seeing their beliefs misrepresented, minimized, or mocked, often without anyone standing up to say, "Wait, that's not what we believe." And when someone did stand up, it was often through outrage or defensiveness, easily dismissed by critics as part of the noise. But Karoline hadn't defended her faith with fire. She had defended it with stillness. She had let the noise crash around her, absorbing the sneers, the assumptions, the condescension, and then answered with a kind of strength that didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't crumble. She simply stood. That's why the moment echoed. It wasn't about politics, though that's what the host tried to turn it into. It wasn't about cultural battles or even theological debates. It was about the idea that belief in something eternal, something sacred, still mattered and could still hold its own in the most secular, media-polished spaces. Days after the show aired, Karoline was asked in a podcast interview whether she had rehearsed her answer. She smiled. "I knew what I believed," she said, "and I knew they wouldn't understand it, but I didn't come to convince them. I came to speak truth, and truth doesn't panic when it's misunderstood." That line became another viral quote. Truth doesn't panic. That's what people remembered. In a world where people often rush to defend themselves, to shout down opposition, or to spin narratives for likes and followers, Karoline had done the opposite. She had listened, she had waited, and when the moment came, she spoke with clarity, humility, and conviction. It was a moment that didn't just defend her faith, It dignified it. It reminded millions watching, whether Christian, skeptic, or somewhere in between, that maybe, just maybe, faith wasn't as fragile as they'd been told. That maybe there was still room in the public square for sacred things, for reverence, for belief that wasn't cynical, performative, or ashamed. In the weeks that followed, opinion pieces sprang up. Some praised her courage, others criticized the show's treatment of religion. A few tried to spin the moment for political gain, but beyond all that noise, a quieter ripple spread. People began rewatching The Chosen. Bible study groups used the clip as a starting point for hard conversations. Parents showed it to their teens. Pastors referenced it in Sunday messages. Not because Karoline was perfect, not because she was famous, but because she didn't flinch. And in a world built on reaction and spectacle, that kind of steady presence was rare enough to be radical. She had walked into a room designed to shake her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise her fists. She raised the standard. And in doing so, she reminded a divided country that there is still strength in stillness, power in quiet conviction, and beauty in belief that refuses to bow to mockery. If you like this video, then subscribe.